In front of 200 guests, Victoria Whitmore threw a rusted key at the feet of Daniel Carter, 45-year-old black single father who cleaned toilets for a living. A car, she said loud enough for the whole lawn to hear. A car for the man who was only ever good enough to clean up after real people. Laughter rolled across the crowd. Daniel bent down, picked up the key, and took his 11-year-old daughter's hand without a word. Under the mud and the rust, something was waiting that none of them could see. A hidden serial number, a forgotten prototype, a secret Charles Whitmore had carried to his grave. What did the old man know? That his own daughter never once thought to ask if you have ever been measured by the smallest thing about you, and found one and stay with this one and subscribe, because what Daniel scraped out from under that rust would expose far more than the price of a car. The rusted key had not always been an insult. 6 months earlier, Daniel Carter still believed that if he kept his head down and did his work well, the Whitmore estate would stay the one steady thing in his life. He drove the grounds truck, before sunrise fixed the leaking pipes in the guest house, and came home each night to a small staff cottage behind the main property where his daughter Maya waited with her homework spread across the kitchen table. Maya was 11, sharp-eyed, and used to a father who rarely spoke about the past unless she asked him twice. 4 years earlier, Daniel had buried his wife Rachel after a cancer that drained every dollar the family had saved. They had built a small restoration garage together, and they had sold it to cover her last round of treatment. Before it went, Rachel made him promise something that still steered every decision he made. Don't let Maya grow up thinking a bank account or a job title or the color of her skin can measure what she's worth. She told him from the hospital bed, "Promise me that's the one thing she never learns from watching you." Daniel carried that promise the way other men carried debt, quietly and every single day. Almost no one at the estate knew that Daniel had grown up inside an automotive workshop in Memphis, taught by his grandfather, Samuel Carter, a black mechanic whose hands could name an engine's trouble just from the sound of it idling. Samuel had spent decades restoring classic American and European cars for collectors who mistook his brilliance for cheap labor. He taught Daniel to read frame numbers, to mix paint formulas the factories had abandoned, and most of all, to tell the difference between a weld laid down at a factory and one made in a garage years later. Before he passed, Samuel left Daniel a worn leather notebook filled with every formula and trick he had ever learned, and one line Daniel still repeated to himself on the hard nights. "People throw away what they don't understand," Samuel used to say. "A car, a neighborhood, a man. The rust on the outside never tells the truth about what's underneath." Charles Whitmore was the one man on the estate who had ever looked at Daniel and seen more than a groundskeeper. Years earlier, Charles had watched him stand beside an idling engine and call the failure before a single panel came off, and from that day, he invited Daniel into the private collection garage to talk shop and study old machines. He treated Maya the same way, letting her borrow books from his library and nudging her towards science with the patience of a man who had no grandchildren of his own. Parked in a far corner of that garage sat a battered silver coupe Charles had bought at a warehouse liquidation in Belgium in 1989, logged in the estate records as an incomplete Mercedes-Benz replica. For most of the years Charles owned it, even he had no reason to think it was anything more than the paperwork claimed. Only in his last 2 years, after quietly cross-referencing old factory documents on his own, did Charles begin to suspect the coupe might be something far rarer. He noticed the hand-shaped body panels, an alloy that felt more like an experiment than production steel, and an engine number that looked stamped over something else. He told no one, not even Daniel, says he had no proof, and a fire at a European warehouse had burned the records that might have confirmed it. All he left behind was a line in his will: the silver coupe bought in Belgium in 1989, stored in Warehouse C, would belong to Daniel Carter. Charles died believing he was handing Daniel a mystery worth solving. He never got the chance to say so out loud. Within weeks of the funeral, his daughter Victoria took control of Whitmore Industries as his new chief executive. To the outside world, she looked like a capable heir. Behind closed doors, she was drowning. A failed hotel expansion had left an $11 million hole in the company's books, one the board had not yet fully traced, though their questions about her leadership sharpened every week. Victoria needed cash, and she needed to protect the image of control she had built. When she looked at the people her father had quietly helped over the years, people like Daniel, she saw only the soft, sentimental style of leadership she meant to erase. Daniel became her first target, not for anything he had done, but because Charles had treated him like family, and Victoria could not stand the reminder. At her first staff meeting, she demoted him from maintenance supervisor to janitor, cut his pay by 40%, and barred him from the collection garage for good. She canceled Maya's library privileges without warning and gave father and daughter 30 days to leave the cottage that had been their home for years. In front of the remaining staff, she called him the cleaning boy, and she said it so easily it was plain she expected no argument. Daniel wanted to argue, but Maya needed a roof, and Rachel's medical debt was still not paid, so he swallowed it and kept working. The second humiliation came weeks later at a private garden gathering. Victoria called Daniel over and asked him for the entertainment of her friends to tell the story of how he once pretended to be a car expert. When he said quietly that Charles used to ask his opinion on the collection, she laughed. My father let him dust a few fenders, she told the crowd, and somehow he decided he was an engineer. Richard Coleman, her former boyfriend and quiet business partner, raised his glass and joined the laughter, and it spread easily among people who had never once seen Daniel as anything but the help. Maya stood close enough to hear all of it. On the drive back to the cottage, she asked her father why he never told anyone how good he really was. Daniel took a while to answer. Some folks don't want to know, he finally said, because if they knew, they'd have to change how they see a man like me. It's easier to keep the world the way they've already decided it is. Maya went quiet, but he noticed the way she watched him after that, as if she were deciding for herself what kind of man she wanted to believe her father was. When Victoria read the will in full and found the line about the coupe, she took it for an old man's sentiment. The record still called the car a damaged replica, so she ordered it towed out of Warehouse C and dumped on the gravel lot behind the maintenance building, uncovered out in the weather. Over the following weeks, rain seeped into the cracked windshield. The tires went flat, the silver paint bubbled and peeled, and a steady coat of rust crept across the body, while Victoria let it rot in plain sight. Then she decided the worthless car could serve one last purpose. At a memorial gathering held in her father's honor, 200 guests standing across the lawn, she called Daniel and Maya forward and threw the rusted key at his feet, calling it the perfect gift for a man who had spent his life cleaning up after other people's things. She announced his firing on the spot and gave him until midnight to be gone. When Maya reached for the key, Daniel stopped her bent and took it himself and walked her away from the laughter without a word in his own defense. That night, with nowhere left to go, father and daughter sat inside the ruined car at the edge of the property. Maya broke the silence. Is this really all they think you're worth? The question landed in Daniel's chest the way Rachel's old promise always did. Instead of answering, reached for the door panel and began running his hands along the metal filling for the shape Samuel had taught him to find decades ago. Under the grime, the curves of the body were clearly hand-formed, nothing like anything off a line. The door structure matched no production model he could remember, and some panels felt lighter than steel had any right to feel. He worked past midnight scraping rust with a screwdriver from the glove box, and near the base of a repaired patch he uncovered a partial stamp that stopped him cold. P03 and below it 55. Samuel's notebook had described 3 experimental Mercedes-Benz prototypes built in 1955. 2 had been accounted for over the decades. The third mark, P03, had vanished from every record after the warehouse fire destroyed the factory's papers. If this really was the lost prototype, and if enough of its original parts had survived, it could be worth as much as $8 million. Daniel sat back and understood exactly what stood in front of him and exactly what it would cost. He could sell the wreck for scrap and keep a roof over Maya's head for a few more months, or he could gamble everything on a truth that might turn out to be nothing. He thought of Rachel's voice steady, even at the end, telling him that Maya's whole sense of her own worth would be shaped by what he chose in moments exactly like this one. Maya, watching his face in the dark, said only, "Great-Grandpa Samuel fixed the stuff other people threw out. Maybe Mr. Whitmore left it to you because he knew you'd actually look." She didn't say it like a lesson. She said it like a kid who had noticed something and wanted her father to notice it too. That night, Daniel picked up his phone and called Robert Miller and asked him to bring a tow truck before sunrise. Robert arrived before the sun came up the way he always had when Daniel called with trouble in his voice. He was 52, ran a small garage on the edge of town, and had worked alongside Daniel years back before Rachel got sick and everything rearranged itself around hospital bills. He took one look at the rusted coupe and asked few questions because the look on Daniel's face told him this was not really about the car. He offered father and daughter the small room behind his garage, the one he used for storage, and told Daniel to worry about rent later, if ever. Standing in the cold, he ran a hand along the ruined hood. This about the car, miss? He asked, or about proving something to a dead man and his daughter. Daniel admitted he wasn't sure, only that he couldn't walk away without knowing. Robert nodded the way he did when he'd already decided to help. Bring the girl inside before she freezes out here with us. Daniel had no money for specialists or modern equipment, so the work fell to his own two hands. By day, he fixed customers' cars for grocery money and Maya's school supplies. At night, long after Robert had gone home, he stayed under a single work lamp and peeled back the decades one section at a time. Maya became his second pair of hands. She photographed each part before it came off, numbered every piece so nothing could be lost, and copied Samuel's crumbling notebook page by page into a fresh one so the original wouldn't fall apart. She also carried her phone everywhere those first weeks, filming short clips for a school project she'd started calling The Hands That Fix Things. Daniel thought the title a little dramatic, though he never said so, and told her again and again to stay clear of the chemicals and the machinery. Her job, he said, was to remember everything because somebody needed an honest record of what happened in that garage long before anyone outside it would believe a word. On the slow nights, Maya sat on an overturned crate near the workbench and kept him talking so he wouldn't fall asleep on his feet. She wanted to know how a whole factory could lose a car, and Daniel explained about the fire, the same fire that had once made Charles give up trying to prove anything. Maya thought that was the saddest part, an old man dying without ever knowing the truth about something sitting in his own garage. She asked if Mr. Whitmore had ever suspected. Daniel said he honestly didn't know, though it would explain the strange, almost apologetic way Charles talked about the car whenever they stood near it. Looking back, Daniel realized Charles had never once called it a replica to his face. He only ever called it the one that got away, a phrase that made a great deal more sense now. Those first nights carried a hope Daniel had not let himself feel in years. As the grime came away, the P03 stamp grew clearer, and beneath the dash he found a small inspection mark unlike anything on a production car. Robert, cautious by nature, insisted they bring in someone with real credentials before going further, and he called a local appraiser named Mark Dawson, a man known for blunt honesty over flattery. Mark examined the coupe for less than an hour. The engine number matched no public Mercedes documentation, he said. The metal around the frame plate showed clear signs of welding. Several components looked to post-date 1955 by years. In his professional opinion, someone had assembled the thing from mismatched parts long after the fact, and he told Daniel to stop pouring money into an elaborate fake. Daniel asked him straight whether mismatched parts could mean anything other than fraud. Mark shook his head. 30 years I've been doing this. Mismatched parts mean exactly what they look like. Hope isn't evidence. Daniel thanked him and walked him out without arguing, but the words followed him inside. Alone with Samuel's notebook that night, he read the same page 3 times, hunting for a reason to keep believing in a car a trained man had just called worthless. For the first time since the memorial, he let himself wonder if he had built a second chance for his family on nothing but desperation, dressed up as hope. The doubt did not last as long as it should have. A few nights later, pulling the dash panel to check the wiring, Daniel saw that the engine number had been stamped over an older mark, one ground down, but not fully erased. Under a magnifying lamp, he worked the oil and metal shavings out of the grooves and uncovered a second sequence beneath a code that appeared in no commercial reference he or Robert could find. And it occurred to him that the parts Mark had dismissed as fraud might instead be evidence of something very specific, components installed during a private testing program that would never appear in any sales catalog. That thought changed everything about how he worked. Instead of reading each mismatched part as a red flag, he treated the car the way Samuel had taught him to treat anything worth saving, assuming first that it deserved patience rather than suspicion. He cleaned the engine by hand rather than replacing parts, preserved every original well exactly as he found it, and rebuilt damaged body sections without swapping out a single authentic panel where he could avoid it. Using Samuel's formulas, he mixed a fresh batch of the original silver, restitched the interior to match old factory photographs. Robert helped him track down and kept every scrap of removed rust and paint in labeled jars in case he ever needed to prove what the car had been. None of it came free. His small savings drained to almost nothing inside a few months, and he faced the decision he had dreaded, whether to sell a few of the rarest original parts just to keep food on the table. Selling them would have meant gutting whatever authenticity the car still held, so instead he took on extra night work, fixing strangers' cars, sleeping less than 4 hours, running on coffee and stubbornness. Maya found him slumped over the bench more than once. She never said it aloud, but he could see the fear behind her eyes, the quiet worry that this car might take the only parent she had left. One night, after finding him asleep upright with a wrench still in his hand, she asked why he kept punishing himself for a car that might be worthless anyway. Daniel pulled her into a hug and told her the truth. "I'm not doing this to get rich, baby. I'm doing it so nobody ever gets to tell you what you're worth. Not a boss, not a rich man, not anybody." Maya rested her head on his shoulder. "I'm not scared of losing the car," she said. "I'm scared of losing you." The next morning, she did something about it. Without telling him, she started rationing his coffee to force him to rest, packed his lunches so he wouldn't skip meals for parts money, and set an alarm on her tablet to send him to bed by 2. It was a child's plan, clumsy and stubborn, and it worked more often than not. Daniel let her think he hadn't noticed because the sight of an 11-year-old trying to take care of him told him something Rachel had been right about all along. Worth was not a thing you inherited or were handed. It was a thing you showed people in the small hours when no one was watching. Nearly 4 months after the tow truck first pulled into the lot, Daniel felt ready to try the engine. It caught on the second turn, and the sound that filled the garage was nothing like a production car, deeper, more mechanical enough to make even Robert go still. Robert admitted this was past both of them now, and he called an old contact, a retired engineer named David Reynolds, 64, who had spent decades at a Mercedes-Benz Heritage Center before retiring. David arrived skeptical and left 3 days later, far less sure of his doubts. The moment he saw the coupe, he ordered that not one more part come off until he had documented everything. Over those 3 days, he confirmed the body was built from an experimental alloy, consistent with 1955 manufacturing, that the P03 mark matched internal Mercedes documentation he remembered, and that many of the welds throughout the frame looked like factory work rather than later repair. "In all my years," David said, arms crossed, standing back from the car, "I've seen very few restorations handled with this much respect for the original material. Most owners with real money behind them cut corners. You didn't." Daniel said he hadn't known what he was looking at when he started, only that Samuel had taught him never to remove something he didn't yet understand. "That instinct is rarer than people think," David told him. "It's the only reason there's anything left here to authenticate." In his professional opinion, there was a strong chance this was the lost P03 prototype, a car that could be worth as much as $8 million if fully certified. But he couldn't sign a final certification yet because 2 problems remained. There was no complete paper trail proving the car's journey from the factory floor to the Belgium liquidation, and the metal around the frame plate showed old welding, which meant a skeptic could always argue the plate had been transplanted from another vehicle. Daniel understood that documentation, or physical proof that the plate had always belonged to this car, was now the only thing between him and a certainty that might silence every doubt, including his own. He spent the following days digging through old auction records and shipping archives, with Robert hunting for any trace of the Belgium sale. He didn't get far before the world found him. A parts courier making a delivery to Robert's garage saw the coupe, asked what it was, and snapped a couple of photos on his way out. Within days, those photos were online under a headline claiming a fire single father might have stumbled onto an $8 million Mercedes prototype and the clip Maya had filmed of the engine starting spread alongside them. Daniel had spent months trying to stay invisible enough to finish in peace, and now his face and his daughter's video were everywhere. Strangers gathered outside the garage. Reporters called for interviews he had no interest in giving. For a few days, it seemed the story might simply be one of an overlooked man finally getting his due. Maya read some of the Kinder articles aloud at the kitchen table, and for the first time in months, Daniel let himself smile at the thought that the world might be catching up to what he already knew. That fragile hope ended the moment the story reached Victoria's desk. She saw at once what the coup could mean, not as a piece of history, but as a way out of the hole she had been digging since she took over. If she could reclaim the car and sell it near 8 million, she could cover most of the hotel shortfall before the board ever learned how deep the damage ran. She hired Thomas Grant, a corporate attorney known for aggressive tactics, and together they set out to destroy Daniel's credibility in the courtroom and the press at once. Rather than admit she had misjudged the car, Victoria built a far more damaging story. She accused Daniel of knowing the coupe was valuable before he ever took ownership, of hiding that knowledge from the family, and of quietly stripping parts from her father's collection to complete the restoration. She went further, claiming the frame plate itself had been transplanted from another car, and that Daniel had conspired with Robert and David to inflate the value of what was really just an elaborate replica. Richard Coleman signed a sworn statement backing her, claiming he personally remembered Daniel talking about a missing Mercedes prototype years earlier, well before Charles died. He described a conversation at an estate function where he said Daniel had bragged that something valuable was sitting in the collection garage that no one else had noticed. The statement was built to suggest Daniel had manipulated a lonely old man into leaving him a fortune dressed up as a worthless gift, and it worked exactly as intended. Reporters who had called Daniel an overlooked genius began calling him the janitor who outsmarted an heiress, and the story was relabeled the biggest classic car scam of the year. At a hastily arranged press conference, Victoria stood behind a podium and told reporters her family had trusted a member of their own staff only to watch that trust twisted into a calculated scheme against a grieving daughter. She never raised her voice and never smiled, and the composure made it land harder than shouting would have. Clips played on repeat through the evening news, each cutting away to an old photo of Daniel in his janitor's uniform, as if the image alone were proof of guilt. Maya felt the change most sharply at school, where classmates who had been curious about the viral video now whispered behind her back, and a handful of parents asked the school to look more closely at her family. A girl. Maya had counted as a friend told her flatly that her dad should just give the car back if he had nothing to hide. One afternoon, Maya came home and asked in a small voice whether it was true that people thought her father was a liar. Daniel knelt in front of her. "The truth doesn't change just because more people decide not to believe it," he said. "You and me, we haven't lied about one single thing we did in that garage. Not one." Using her influence over the Whitmore Foundation, Victoria had Maya's scholarship suspended pending the outcome of what she now called an active fraud investigation. Daniel watched his daughter come home quieter each day, and for the first time since he found that stamp, he began to wonder whether the truth was worth what it was costing her. It was into that exhaustion that Victoria's offer arrived. She would pay Daniel $300,000 if he returned the car. Publicly admitted he had misunderstood the will, stated that she had never meant to humiliate him, signed a strict confidentiality agreement, and never spoke again about the video from the memorial. The money was enough to clear Rachel's remaining debt, buy a stable home, and secure Maya's education without another day of fighting. Daniel was not afraid of losing money he had never expected to have. He was terrified of watching his daughter keep bleeding for a battle that felt more and more like his alone to lose. Grant, sensing a chance to close the matter for good, hired a metallurgist, but Victoria had already secured a court order barring further access to the vehicle without her legal team present, so the expert worked only from photographs of the frame plate. Working from images under obvious pressure to deliver fast, the metallurgist concluded the metal around the P03 mark had been cut and rewelded without ever admitting that a photo gave him no reliable way to tell a recent weld from one nearly 70 years old. Victoria used the report to request an emergency order, and the judge granted it before Daniel's side could properly respond. Within days, a tow truck arrived with two sheriff's deputies, and Daniel watched from the doorway as the coupe he had rebuilt by hand was winched onto a flatbed and driven away. His restoration records were seized as evidence. He was formally placed under investigation for fraud, a phrase that felt unreal, coming from a uniformed officer in Robert's driveway. Robert was forced to close his doors as customers, unwilling to be near the scandal, canceled one after another, under pressure from both Mercedes-Benz and the media. David Reynolds felt compelled to publicly withdraw his preliminary findings until further evidence surfaced. In a single week, Daniel lost the car, the one expert willing to vouch for it, his best friend's livelihood, his daughter's scholarship, and the fragile public sympathy that had briefly made him feel like something other than invisible. Outlets that had called him a hidden genius now mocked the $8 million hoax, and every ounce of hope he had allowed himself felt about to be turned into a weapon. Convinced the fight would only cost Maya more, Daniel decided to accept Victoria's offer and sign away any claim to the car. Robert tried to talk him out of it, reminding him how far they had come and how much that engine starting had meant to people who had never had reason to root for a man like Daniel before. Daniel told him he was grateful for everything, but no amount of history was worth what this was doing to his daughter's childhood. He sat at Robert's kitchen table the night before the meeting with Grant's office, staring at the settlement papers under a single lamp, telling himself that $300,000 and an end to the noise was worth more than a truth nobody outside that garage seemed willing to believe. He was still telling himself that when Maya sat down across from him. She had remembered something they had both lost in the chaos. Daniel's phone had been seized with everything else, but her school tablet backed up her video project automatically to a separate account, one no one had thought to touch. While her father went quiet at the table, she sat on the floor of the back room and scrolled through months of footage she had barely looked at since filming it, her hands not quite steady, half expecting the files to be gone or corrupted. Instead, she found the very first clip she had ever recorded, filmed the night the coupe arrived, long before any reporter or expert had laid eyes on it. It ran unbroken, showing her father scraping away mud and rust for the first time, revealing the P03 mark exactly as it already sat on the metal, corrosion spread evenly across both the plate and the steel around it. Nowhere did he cut, remove, or weld anything. Robert stood several feet off the whole time, never once touching the car. She carried the tablet to the kitchen and set it in front of her father. "Everybody keeps saying you built a fake," she said, "but I recorded the exact minute you found it, before anybody had a reason to lie." Daniel watched it twice in silence and understood that his daughter had unknowingly preserved the one piece of evidence that might save him sitting on a school account the whole time in the one place no one thought to look. But it was Daniel who stood up. He picked up the settlement, tore it cleanly in half, and told Maya they were not signing anything. They were going to court, and he already knew how he meant to fight it because he was the only man alive who could walk a jury through that metal, weld by weld. Maya asked if he was scared. He admitted he was more scared than he had been in a long time. But being scared never stopped your great-grandpa from fixing a car everybody called garbage, he said, and it never stopped your mama from making me promise to raise you right. We faced this the way we faced everything since that night, together, and we don't apologize for the truth. The trial drew national attention within days. Reporters who had camped outside Robert's garage now filled the courthouse steps before dawn. Victoria arrived each morning with a full team of lawyers and expert witnesses seated behind her. Daniel had only Angela Brooks, a 51-year-old civil rights attorney who had spent her career representing working people against corporations far larger than Whitmore Industries. Presiding was Judge Susan Parker, 59, known for a courtroom with little patience for theatrics and less for weak evidence. Daniel sat beside Angela the first morning, watching Victoria's team unload boxes of documents with nothing in front of him but Samuel's notebook and Maya's hand resting on his knee under the table. He had spent months learning to read metal, never expecting to end up learning the language of subpoenas instead. "The truth rarely needs decoration," Angela told him quietly. just enough room to be heard. That's all I plan to give it. The case came down to two questions: whether the coupe in the evidence lot was truly the lost P03 prototype worth $8 million, and whether Daniel Carter had lawfully come to own it or had built an elaborate fraud around a worthless machine. Grant opened for Victoria with the welded metal report, Richard Coleman's sworn statement, and the argument that Daniel had studied the collection long enough to know exactly what he was inheriting before Charles ever signed the will. Mark Dawson took the stand and repeated that the vehicle was almost certainly an assembled replica. David Reynolds, still bound by the pressure that had forced his retraction, admitted under oath that he had not yet issued a final certification. For a long stretch of the morning, it seemed Daniel might lose everything a second time now, in front of cameras broadcasting to the whole country. Angela opened the defense by playing the raw footage from Maya's tablet, which a data specialist confirmed had never been edited and carried an unaltered timestamp from months before the story reached the press. The courtroom watched in silence as Daniel on screen scraped away mud for the very first time and revealed the Pizzo 3 mark exactly as it already existed, with no sign of him altering a thing. It was the first moment the story Victoria had built began visibly to crack. Then Angela did something Grant had not expected. Rather than lean only on David Reynolds, she called Daniel himself to the stand and let him teach. With the frame plate photographs enlarged behind him, Daniel walked the jury through the metal, the way Samuel had once walked him through it, showing them the difference between a weld laid at a factory and one made in a backyard, pointing to the even corrosion that could not have formed in months, naming the alloy, and why no counterfeiter in 1989 would have had a reason to fake a car everyone believed was gone. He was not a lawyer, and he did not try to be one. He was the one man in the room who had actually touched every inch of that car, and the jury could see it. When Grant tried to rattle him, Daniel answered every question plainly because he had nothing to hide and knew the metal better than anyone Victoria could buy. Angela then recalled David Reynolds this time, granting him direct access to the vehicle rather than secondhand photographs. Standing before the court, David explained that the earlier metallurgist had mistaken a genuine factory repair for a modern one, unable from a photo to tell rewelding done at Mercedes in 1955 from anything done last year. Newly surfaced factory archives confirmed that the P03 prototype had been cut and reinforced near its frame plate after an internal speed test, the very detail Victoria's team had used to accuse Daniel on. The strongest proof the car was authentic, through a subpoena of Whitmore Industries records. Angela introduced the original 1989 invoice from the Belgium sale, along with shipping paperwork and photographs taken before the car ever entered the family's collection. Among those records was a handwritten note in Charles Whitmore's own hand, dated 2 years before his death, stating plainly that he suspected the coupe might be the missing prototype, but lacked the proof to confirm it, and that Daniel Carter was the only person he trusted to find the truth without destroying the car. Angela pointed out that the note was written years after the moment Richard Coleman claimed to have overheard Daniel discussing a missing prototype, which meant Daniel would have had to know something Charles himself had not yet suspected. Under questioning, Richard admitted he could not be certain of the timing of the conversation he had sworn to, and acknowledged his statement had been prepared at Victoria's request while the lawsuit was being assembled. The accusation that had followed Daniel through months of public shame collapsed the moment its own timeline was tested. Angela also entered the photographs Robert had taken the night the coupe arrived, timestamped weeks before any restoration, showing rust, cracked glass, and peeling paint already covering the car damage that had built up while it sat exposed on Victoria's orders. If anyone bore responsibility for the condition of a historic vehicle, Angela argued it was the person who ordered it left out in the rain, not the man who spent 4 months trying to save it. Finally, she played the memorial footage itself, the same clip that had once circulated only as a viral moment of humiliation. It showed Victoria throwing the key at Daniel's feet, calling the car his severance, and ordering him off the property before midnight, actions that made plain she had knowingly transferred ownership. Angela paired it with the text Victoria had sent Richard shortly after the party, boasting that she had handed her father's employee a pile of rusted junk and enjoyed watching his face. The message proved she had not been deceived when she gave the car away. She had only regretted it once its true value became known. With the timeline, the metallurgy, and Victoria's own words laid bare, Angela closed simply. Victoria Whitmore looked at a laborer and a pile of rust. Daniel Carter looked at the same object and saw history. The mistake was never made by the man who had the knowledge to see it. It was made by the woman who believed her money excused her from ever looking closely at anything at all. Judge Parker ruled that the vehicle was a genuine verified P03 prototype, that Daniel had not altered the frame plate or removed any part of the collection, and that the accusation had no basis once the real timeline was examined. She found that Charles Whitmore had knowingly and intentionally left the car to Daniel, and that Victoria had voluntarily completed the transfer at the memorial. The lawsuit was dismissed in full, and the coupe was ordered returned to Daniel Carter as its rightful and sole owner. Daniel did not celebrate. He sat for a moment with his hand over Maya's, thinking less about the 8 million, now legally his, than about every night in that garage when he had wondered if the truth would ever be enough. Outside reporters who had called him a fraud shouted questions about how it felt to be vindicated. I never needed a verdict to know what I built, he told them. I just needed everyone else to finally look twice. In the weeks that followed, Mercedes-Benz sent a team of international specialists to complete a final certification, confirming the coupe as the long-lost experimental prototype missing for nearly 70 years, with an official value of roughly $8 million. The same outlets that had branded Daniel a fraud were forced to run corrections, and Maya's footage became widely recognized as proof of both her father's skill and his honesty. Under public pressure, the Whitmore Foundation reinstated her scholarship and sent a formal apology to her school. An internal investigation at Whitmore Industries uncovered the full extent of Victoria's mismanagement, including the hidden $11 million shortfall, undervalued assets sold quietly to Richard Coleman, and company funds diverted to finance a personal lawsuit. Victoria was removed as chief executive, and Richard came under separate investigation for his role in the falsified deals. The board that had once quietly doubted her leadership now had every answer it needed delivered, not by an auditor, but by a courtroom she herself had insisted on filling. Asked what he would say to Victoria, Daniel answered simply, "The car never made me valuable. It only made the world see the value my daughter saw in me the whole time." Months later, the coupe went to auction. Daniel and Maya seated in the front row beside Robert. The bidding climbed steadily from 4 million past 5, then 6, then 7, before settling above 8 million when the gavel fell. Maya took her father's hand as the room erupted, and her tears had nothing to do with the number on the board. They came from watching the world finally see her father the way she always had. Daniel used the money to clear the last of Rachel's medical debt, buy a stable home, and help Robert reopen the garage the lawsuit had shuttered. He established a scholarship in Maya's name and opened a tuition-free trade school, the Carter Automotive Restoration Academy, built on the belief that skill and worth are never decided by where a person starts. Inside stood the Samuel Carter Workshop, preserving his grandfather's notebook and the Rachel Carter Scholarship, created for single parents learning a trade of their own. Beside a photo archive Maya chose to oversee herself. On opening day, Daniel stood before his first-class young men and women who had been told somewhere along the way that they weren't smart enough or qualified enough or simply worth the investment. People might call you unqualified, unworthy, beneath their notice, he told them. But the rust on the outside of anything never decides what's waiting underneath. He looked out at faces that reminded him of himself at 20, hungry for someone to believe in what their hands could do, and made a quiet promise that this place would never let another Daniel Carter go unseen. Behind him hung 3 photographs, Samuel with a wrench in his old Memphis garage, Rachel holding Maya as an infant, and Charles Whitmore standing beside Daniel in the collection garage that had once refused to see him as anything more than staff. Beneath them ran a single line dedicated to those who saw them before the world was willing to look. At the end of the day, Maya handed her father the rusted key from that night at the memorial, now sealed inside a glass frame. The inscription beneath it marked the day they tried to use it to humiliate him, and the day he taught his daughter that no one has the right to put a price on who she is. Daniel held the frame a long moment, looking not at the key, but at his daughter beside him, older now, steadier, now carrying herself like someone who had already learned the lesson he once feared she would learn the hard way. He had restored far more than an $8 million automobile. He had restored his own name, secured his daughter's future, and turned the object once used to shame him into a doorway for everyone the world had already decided to forget. If this story reminded you that the rust on the outside never tells the whole truth about what a person carries inside, don't scroll past it in silence. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment about someone in your life the world underestimated, and share it with anyone who needs to hear it today. Stay close for the next story, because somewhere out there, another Daniel Carter is still waiting for the world to finally look twice.